America knows Terry Crews as one of the most distinctive faces in modern entertainment. Before becoming a television star, he was a professional athlete in the National Football League, drafted by the Los Angeles Rams in the 1991 draft, and later playing for teams like the San Diego Chargers and Washington Redskins. Although his NFL career didn't last as long as many superstars, it forged a man with iron discipline and relentless willpower. When he stepped into Hollywood, Terry Crews wrote an entirely different chapter of his life. He became famous for his strong, yet humorous roles in movies like White Chicks, The Expendables, and Idiocracy. However, the real turning point came when he took on the role of Terry Jeffords in Brooklyn Nine-Nine, a character who was both funny and warm, making him one of the most beloved faces on American television. Alongside that, he became the high-energy host of America's Got Talent, where he not only led the show but also inspired millions of viewers. Throughout his career, Crews has received numerous nominations and awards, including nominations at the Screen Actors Guild Awards and many viewer-chosen television awards. Beyond acting, he is also the author of the acclaimed memoir Manhood, a work praised for its honesty and courage in speaking about his real life. But behind all those achievements is a story few people know. Terry Crews did not grow up in safety or privilege. He grew up in Flint, Michigan, in a home where domestic violence happened almost every night. As a boy, he often had to stand and watch his mother being beaten by his alcoholic father, and that feeling of helplessness followed him for decades. Later, when his NFL dream ended, he left football with very little money and a future full of uncertainty, at one point having to draw courtroom illustrations to make a living. His marriage to Rebecca King Crews also once stood on the brink of collapse when he admitted to being addicted to pornography and had to go through a painful therapy process to change himself. And then there was another moment. A moment that made all of Hollywood take notice, when Crews bravely spoke out that he had been sexually assaulted by a powerful figure in the entertainment industry. For many people, Terry Crews' strength lies in his muscles and massive physique, but the truth is that his greatest strength lies in his ability to rise after wounds the world cannot see. He didn't just fight to succeed. He fought to become the man that frightened boy from years ago always hoped he could be. If the story behind Terry Crews' smile makes you think, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next inspiring stories. After all the smiles that television audiences see, after the rounds of applause echoing in brightly lit studios, Terry Crews' story actually began in a completely different place. Not Hollywood, not a dazzling stage under bright lights, but an old industrial city called Flint, Michigan. Flint in the 1970s was not a place that nurtured big dreams. Factories were closing, money was scarce, and many families lived in a spiral of poverty and despair. But for Terry Crews, the city's poverty was not the scariest thing. The real hell for that boy lay right inside his own home. Terry's father was a heavy alcoholic. When sober, he could be quiet and cold. But when alcohol took over his body, the Crews family's small house immediately turned into a battlefield. Evenings began in tense silence, then gradually turned into uncontrollable explosions. The sound of a liquor bottle slammed down on the table, the sound of heavy footsteps, and then, almost inevitably, screams rang out in the cramped space of the house. Little Terry was very young at the time, but a child's memory can sometimes be cruelly sharp. He remembers every sound clearly, the door slamming against the wall, objects shattering on the floor, and worst of all, the cries of his mother, the woman he loved most in the world. Many nights Terry could only stand huddled in a corner of the room, back pressed against the cold wall, hands clenched so tightly they turned white. He trembled but didn't dare step forward, didn't dare say anything, didn't dare intervene, because he knew a heartbreaking truth: a child cannot stop a drunken man. That feeling of helplessness was like a rock pressing down on his chest. There were moments when Terry wanted to rush out, wanted to protect his mother, but his feet wouldn't move. Fear held him back, and each time, after the violence passed, he sank into an indescribable shame. Many years later, as a grown man, Terry Crews still clearly remembers one particularly painful memory. One night, his father flew into a rage more violent than usual. Words quickly turned into violence. In the dim yellow light of the room, Terry saw his father raise his hand and strike his mother so hard that she fell to the floor. The sound of her body hitting the ground rang out dry and sharp. That moment seemed to stretch on forever. Little Terry stood frozen. His heart pounded so hard his ears rang. He watched his mother lying on the floor, struggling to get up, but he didn't step forward. He didn't yell. He didn't do anything. He just stood and watched. Decades later, when recounting this memory, Terry Crews still says it was one of the greatest shames of his life. Not because he did something wrong, but because he felt he hadn't done enough. But the truth is, back then he was just a child living in a world where violence had become frighteningly familiar. In that house, Terry learned a lesson much earlier than many other children. Physical strength doesn't always protect people from pain. And sometimes the deepest wounds leave no marks on the skin. They lie deep in memory, in sleepless nights, in the feeling of helplessness when seeing the person you love most get hurt. Those years in Flint etched a special fear deep into Terry Crews' soul. He feared that one day he would become like his father. That anger, violence, and despair could pass from one generation to the next like a curse. And strangely, that very fear became one of the strongest driving forces in his life. Because from a very early age, little Terry silently promised himself one thing. If he could escape this place, if he could become a different man, he would break that cycle. But back in those childhood years, when standing trembling in the dark corner of the house in Flint, that promise seemed as distant as a dream. At that time, Terry Crews was not a television star. He was not the powerful giant the world would later know. He was just a small boy trying to survive through each long night of childhood. And that boy had no idea yet that the wounds of the past would follow him throughout his entire life. Those long nights in the house full of violence in Flint, Michigan, didn't just leave painful memories in Terry Crews' childhood. They left a much deeper obsession, a fear that little Terry carried with him for many years afterward. The fear that one day he would become just like his father. When he was young, Terry didn't have enough words to describe that feeling. But he understood one thing very clearly. The man he saw every night in a drunken rage was not the person he wanted to become. He hated violence. He hated the way his father made the whole house sink into fear. He hated the feeling of helplessness when watching his mother get hurt. But at the same time, Terry also realized a truth that scared him even more. The anger was growing inside him. There were days when he was bullied at school or when he witnessed another argument at home. Terry felt a surge of rage ignite in his chest. It was hot, fierce, and hard to control. That terrified him, because he knew exactly what that anger looked like. It looked exactly like his father's anger. That thought sent Terry into a panic. He began to wonder if violence was something passed down from one generation to the next. Whether one day he too would become the man who made others afraid, just like his father had been. It was that very fear that made Terry start looking for a different path. While many kids his age spent time playing after school, Terry sought out places where he could release all the pent-up energy in his body. At first, it was just simple sports practice, running as fast as he could, lifting heavy objects, pushing his body to the limit. Then gradually, training became an indispensable part of his life. Terry started going to the gym for the first time. He was still very young. The gym wasn't anything fancy. Old weights, worn floors, and a strong metallic smell. But for Terry, that place was like a different world. A place where he could control his body. a place where his anger could be turned into strength. Every time he lifted a weight, he felt like he was pushing back the fear in his heart. Every drop of sweat that fell to the floor was like a way to shed the painful memories of childhood. But most importantly, Terry wasn't training to become famous. At that time, he hadn't even thought about Hollywood. He wasn't dreaming about stadiums packed with fans. All he wanted was a very simple feeling, the feeling of not being weak anymore. In the house where he grew up, weakness meant helplessness. Weakness meant having to stand and watch the people he loved get hurt, without being able to do anything. Terry didn't want to live with that feeling ever again, so he trained, day after day, repeating the movements until his muscles ached. As his body began to change, Terry also felt his mind change along with it. Physical strength gave him a confidence he had never had before, but more importantly, it helped him understand that a person can choose who they will become. He wasn't destined to follow his father's path. He wasn't forced to carry violence like an inheritance. Every time he stepped into the gym, Terry reminded himself that he was building a new person. A man who could be strong without hurting anyone. A man who could control his anger instead of letting it control him. And it was in those quiet years that something else also began to take shape. Terry discovered that his body had a special talent for sports. His strength, speed, and endurance started to catch the attention of the coaches at school. For the first time in his life, Terry realized that what had once been his fierce strength could become the path to escape his past. But even as opportunities began to appear, the old obsession never completely disappeared. Every time he looked in the mirror, Terry didn't just see a boy becoming stronger. He also saw a reminder of the promise he had made to himself from a very early age, that no matter where life took him, no matter how strong he became, he would never be allowed to become the man that frightened boy from years ago had feared the most. And that promise would follow him for the rest of his life. From those quiet training sessions in the old gym, where the boy once tried to use strength to fight the fear in his heart, Terry Crew's life began to open up a new path. At first, sports was just a way for Terry to release the anger and pain of his childhood. But over time, the coaches at school began to notice something special about this young man. Terry's body wasn't just strong. It was disciplined, resilient, and had an astonishing ability to endure. When others got tired and stopped, Terry kept going. When others gave up, he kept training. And it was in those long, exhausting sessions that a dream began to form. Football became an escape, not just a sport, but the only way for Terry Crews to leave behind the painful past in Flint. On the field, everything became clearer. No more screams in the night. No more painful memories of family violence. Just the sound of cleats hitting the grass, the coach's loud calls, and the feeling of his body charging forward with all its power. Terry started playing football with a determination few could understand. For many other players, it was just a sport. But for Terry, it was a ticket out of his old life. And then the real opportunity came. Terry Crews received a sports scholarship to Western Michigan University. For a boy who grew up in poverty, that scholarship was like a miracle. For the first time in his life, Terry felt the door to the future opening before him. But the scholarship wasn't an easy gift. It was the result of thousands of hours of training, of cold mornings running when his body still ached, of evenings so exhausted he could barely lift his arms. At college, Terry continued to forge his body like a machine. Those around him quickly noticed his incredible strength. Broad shoulders, thick muscles, a terrifying ability to take hits. But what impressed the coaches the most wasn't that strength. It was the discipline. Terry Crews trained with near absolute focus. No partying, no wasting time. Every practice, every game was like a step closer to the dream he had held since he was a boy, trembling in the corner of the room. That dream had a name that every young football player craved: the National Football League. The NFL wasn't just America's biggest football league. It was a symbol of success, of fame, and of a completely different life. For Terry Crews, the NFL carried an even deeper meaning. It was the chance to leave the past behind, the chance to prove that the boy who once lived in fear could become a strong man. The college years passed in fierce games and grueling practices that lasted until exhaustion. Terry grew stronger, faster, tougher, but inside, he was still the boy who feared becoming like his father. It was that fear that never allowed Terry to let himself be lazy. Every time he lifted a weight, he reminded himself that this wasn't just physical strength. This was the way to build a new life. And as the professional draft approached, Terry Crews knew that all his years of fighting were leading to the decisive moment. If he succeeded, he would step into the NFL and begin a completely new chapter of his life. If he failed, he might return to Flint, back to the familiar streets of the past he had tried to escape for so many years. So Terry played football like a man with no way back. Every tackle, every collision carried the longing to escape the past. He wasn't just fighting for victory on the field. He was fighting for a different future, a future where the boy who once trembled in the dark corner could finally step out of the shadows. But Terry Crews didn't yet know that the NFL dream, the dream he believed was his path to salvation, would not unfold the way he imagined. And when that dream began to crack, he would have to face a truth even more painful than his own childhood. The dream that Terry Crews pursued throughout his young years finally came close. After seasons full of effort at Western Michigan University, the professional draft day opened the door he believed would change his life forever. For Terry, this wasn't just a chance to play at the highest level. It was the ticket out of his past. It was the opportunity to prove that the boy who once lived in fear in Flint could become a successful man. When his name was called in the National Football League draft by the Los Angeles Rams, Terry Crews believed his life had finally turned a page. It was the moment many young athletes spend their entire youth chasing. To wear the jersey of an NFL team, to step onto the field in front of tens of thousands of fans. But the reality of the NFL wasn't like the dream. At this level, every player is strong, everyone is fast, everyone is talented, and every position can be replaced after just one bad game. Terry Crews quickly realized that the NFL was a colder world than he imagined. No room for weakness, no room for touching stories. Only results. And if you're not the best, there's always someone else ready to take your place. In his first seasons, Terry had to fight to keep his spot on the roster. But he wasn't a star, not the guy making plays that made fans jump to their feet cheering. He was a backup player, someone who often had to wait for his chance from the bench outside the field. In the NFL, backup players are the most forgotten. They train as hard as anyone. They hit as hard as anyone. But the spotlight rarely shines on them. After his time with the Los Angeles Rams, Terry continued his journey with other teams, including the San Diego Chargers and Washington Redskins. Every team change was a restart, learning a new playbook, proving himself to a new coach, competing against younger, faster players. The life of a non-superstar NFL player is a chain of instability, short-term contracts, injuries always lurking, and the fear that tomorrow the phone might ring with a short message, "You're no longer on the team." Terry Crews played with all his effort. He trained as if every practice could be his last chance. But gradually, the truth became clear. The NFL wasn't where he would become a legend. His time in the league passed faster than he thought. Younger players started appearing. Opportunities to play kept shrinking. And then, one day, Terry Crews' NFL career quietly ended. No big farewell ceremony. No grand goodbyes on the stadium field. Just a contract, not renewed. A phone call. A thank you. And that was it. After years of fighting to achieve the dream, Terry Crews left the NFL almost the way many lesser-known players leave. Quietly, no big articles written about it, no TV shows talking about it. To the football world, he was just a small name on a long list of players who had passed through the league. But for Terry, it was a devastating mental shock. For so many years, he had believed the NFL was the path to escape his past. But when that path closed, he suddenly felt like he was standing in a frighteningly familiar place. No more stadium lights, no more weekend games. Just a young man with an uncertain future. And what hurt Terry Crews the most wasn't that he didn't become a star. It was the feeling that after all the effort, no one really remembered him. The years of battling on the field seemed to vanish quickly. The NFL world moved forward with new players, new games, new stories. And Terry Crews, the man who once believed football would save his life, now had to face a question he had never prepared to answer. If he was no longer an NFL player, then who was he? And the scariest part was that he began to realize his real battle had probably never been on the field. It was still waiting for him ahead. His football career ended faster than Terry Crews ever imagined. After years of fighting to survive in the National Football League, he left the field not with glory, but with a hard-to-accept truth. The dream was over, and real life was just beginning now. But what Terry didn't anticipate was how tough life after the NFL would be. Many people think NFL players leave the league with millions of dollars in the bank, but for non-superstar players, the story is often very different. Salaries aren't as big as people think, careers are short, and when contracts end, the money flow stops almost immediately. Just a short time after leaving the field, Terry Crews realized that the little money he had saved was nearly gone. Bills kept coming regularly. Rent, electricity, food, and he no longer had a professional player's salary to cover it all. The man who once stood on the field in front of tens of thousands of fans now faced a brutal reality. He had to find any job he could to support his family. Terry Crews didn't have many options, but he had one skill few people knew about. Before becoming an athlete, he had a talent for art. While in college, he had studied illustration and design. So, when life got tough, he went back to pencil and paper. One of his first jobs was drawing courtroom illustrations, quick sketches of witnesses, lawyers, and judges that he drew in the courtroom, then sold to local TV stations. It wasn't glamorous work. No stage lights, no cheering crowds, just a nearly 6-foot-tall man sitting quietly in the corner of the courtroom, focused on drawing to earn small amounts of money. Besides courtroom illustrations, Terry took any job that could bring in income. There were times he worked as a security guard, a giant who once played in the NFL standing guard at office buildings, quietly watching people pass by without anyone recognizing he had once been a professional player. Long night shifts gave him plenty of time to think. Sometimes he wondered if all those years fighting on the field had really changed anything in his life. During the day, Terry kept drawing and trying to sell his work for extra money. He drew portraits, illustrations, anything that could sell. But the money was still very little. There were days when sitting at the kitchen table with his wife Rebecca King Crews, Terry had to stare at unpaid bills and wonder how they would make it through the next month. There were moments he truly didn't know if he would have enough money to pay the rent. It was a feeling few people imagine when thinking about a former NFL player. The man who once wore a professional team's uniform now had to count every penny to survive. But what hurt Terry the most wasn't the money. It was the feeling of failure. He had once believed football would change his life. He had thought that if he could make it to the NFL, everything would be fine. But standing in his small apartment, looking at unsold drawings and unpaid bills, Terry began to feel like he had returned right back to the place he had tried so hard to leave. Poverty, uncertainty, and full of anxiety. The giant who once played in the NFL was now struggling just to get through each month. But it was in that dark period that Terry Crews began to learn a lesson he would repeat many times later. That sometimes the moments when everything falls apart aren't the end of the story. Sometimes that's just where life forces us to start over from the beginning. And Terry Crews at that time still didn't know that the road ahead of him, though full of difficulties, would lead him to a place he had never dared to dream of. The months of struggling to make a living after leaving the National Football League made Terry Crews' life more fragile than ever. Money was running out, the future was unclear, and the burden of supporting his family weighed heavily on his shoulders every day. But while Terry Crews wrestled with external hardships, another battle was quietly raging inside him. A battle no one could see. A battle he himself took many years to find the courage to admit. A secret that began destroying his life from within: addiction to pornography. At first, it appeared as a small habit, a way to escape stress and disappointment. In those days, filled with anxiety about money and the future, Terry turned to it as a temporary escape, a way to forget the pressure, even if just for a few minutes. But like many other addictions, what started as a habit gradually became something that controlled him. Those brief moments of entertainment turned into long hours in the dark. The images on the screen began to take over his mind, creeping into his thoughts even when he was working, talking to his family, or trying to sleep. Terry Crews later admitted that at that time, he felt like he was living two different lives. One life was the person the world saw, the strong, disciplined man always trying to be the pillar for his family, the tall man who once played in the NFL, trying to rebuild his life after failures. But the other life existed in the shadows. There, Terry was a man out of control, a man caught in a cycle of shame, secrecy, and addiction. What hurt Terry the most was how this addiction began to affect his marriage to Rebecca King Crews. Rebecca was the one who stood by Terry in his hardest days, when he had almost no money left after leaving the NFL, when he had to take small jobs to support the family, when he sat for hours at the drawing table to earn tiny amounts of money. She was there when the world didn't even know his name. And because of that, she was also the first to notice that the man she loved was slowly changing. Terry was no longer present in their marriage the way he used to be. He was still at home, still talking, still trying to play the role of husband and father. But something had changed in his eyes. He was more distant, quieter, and sometimes seemed completely absent, even though he was sitting right in front of her. Rebecca sensed the change, but she didn't know why. She only knew that the man she loved seemed to be becoming a stranger. Terry felt that change too, and it pulled him even deeper into the spiral of shame. Every time he told himself he would stop, he failed. Every failure made the guilt grow bigger. And to forget that feeling, he turned back to the very thing that caused it. It was a cruel cycle, a cycle many people fall into but rarely dare to speak about. Terry Crews later described that period as living in a dark room with no windows. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know how to get out. And the most painful thing was that he understood his behavior was hurting the person he loved most. There were nights when he looked at his wife sleeping beside him. Terry felt a profound shame. He knew he was keeping a secret that could destroy everything they had built together, but instead of facing it, he kept hiding it, because admitting the truth meant having to confront himself. And that was the hardest thing. Those years were a time when Terry Crews, though appearing strong on the outside, was actually fighting an invisible battle, a battle with no audience, no coach, no teammates, just one man and the demons in his mind. And what makes this story even more heartbreaking is that Terry Crews, who had spent his whole life trying not to become the man his father was, began to realize that his own secrets and shame were destroying his family in a different way, not through violence, but through distance, through dishonesty, and through things left unsaid. Terry Crews at that time still didn't know that this secret was about to come to light, and when it did, it would push his marriage to the brink of collapse. The years of living in secrecy and shame finally led to a moment Terry Crews could no longer avoid. For a long time, he had tried to keep everything in the dark. He believed that if he was strong enough, if he was disciplined enough, he could handle his problem on his own without anyone knowing. But the truth is that secrets, when kept too long, don't disappear. They only grow bigger until there's no way to hide them anymore. And the first person to feel that change was the woman who'd been by his side through the hardest years of his life, Rebecca King Crews. Rebecca wasn't just Terry Crews' wife. She was the one who had seen him when he had nothing left. When he left the NFL with very little money, when he had to do odd jobs to support the family, when he sat for hours drawing to earn small payments. She was there when the world didn't know his name, and because of that, she was also the first to realize that the man she loved was slowly changing. Terry was no longer present in their marriage the way he used to be. He was still at home, still talking, still trying to play the role of husband and father. But something had changed in his eyes. He was more distant, quieter, and sometimes seemed completely absent, even though he was sitting right in front of her. Rebecca sensed the change, but she didn't know why. She only knew that their marriage was slowly cracking. Conversations became tense. Silences grew longer. And then one day, the truth Terry had hidden for so many years was finally exposed. When Rebecca discovered her husband's secret, her world seemed to collapse. For Terry, his pornography addiction had become a deeply shameful personal battle. But for Rebecca, it was a profound betrayal. She felt hurt, deceived, and abandoned in her own marriage. All the years she had trusted him, all the sacrifices she had made, suddenly felt fragile. The conversation between them that day was one of the most painful moments in Terry Crews' life. Rebecca looked straight at him, her eyes no longer angry but only exhausted, and she said a sentence Terry would never forget. "I can't live with this person anymore." Those words felt like a knife straight into his heart. In that moment, Terry Crews felt his entire world crumbling. Not because of fame, not because of money, but because the woman he loved most was standing in front of him saying she no longer recognized who he was. And right in that moment, a painful realization hit him unexpectedly. Terry realized that even though he had spent his whole life trying not to become like his father, he was still destroying his family in a different way. His father had hurt the family with violence. Terry was doing it with secrecy, with distance, and with choices he had hidden in the dark. Two different paths, but the same result. A family standing on the edge of breaking apart. Realizing that made Terry Crews feel a deeper shame than anything he had ever experienced. All the years he had tried to become a better man than his father suddenly seemed meaningless, because in the end he had still made the woman he loved suffer. In that quiet room that day, Terry was no longer the powerful giant the world saw on screen. He was just a man standing on the verge of losing his family. And for the first time in many years, he was forced to face the truth he had tried to avoid. He could no longer live two lives. He could no longer keep his problems hidden in the dark. Because if he did, he would lose everything. Rebecca didn't yell. She didn't make a dramatic scene. Her silence was even more painful. She simply made it clear that if Terry didn't change, their marriage would end. Not in the distant future, but right now. For Terry Crews, that was the moment all illusions collapsed. No more excuses, no more places to hide. Only one question left. Did he have the courage to face himself? And the answer to that question would decide the fate of his family. After that painful conversation with Rebecca King Crews, their home fell into a heavy silence. There were no more big arguments, no more prolonged accusations. Only distance remained, and sometimes that very silence was more terrifying than any anger. For Terry Crews, it was the moment he was forced to look straight at the truth he had avoided for so many years. He had spent his entire life fighting the outside world. He had fought to escape his violent childhood in Flint. He had fought on the fields of the National Football League. He had fought to support his family when money ran out. But Terry Crews' greatest battle had never taken place on the field. It took place inside him. And this time, he could no longer run away. After many days of reflection, Terry made a decision he had always avoided before. He began therapy. Stepping into a therapy room for the first time was unlike anything Terry had ever experienced. In football, problems were solved with strength. In the gym, everything was handled with discipline. But, in that small, quiet room, Terry Crews had to do something he had never learned how to do: speak the truth about himself. At first, it felt almost impossible. For years, Terry had built his image as a strong man who controlled everything, a man not easily defeated. But in therapy, he couldn't bring that mask with him. He had to start from where everything truly began: his childhood. The memories from the house in Flint, Michigan, came rushing back stronger than ever. The screams in the night, the image of his mother being knocked to the floor, the feeling of helplessness, standing in the corner of the room, trembling and unable to do anything. Terry realized those memories had never left him. They had only been buried deep beneath layers of strength and success. But they were still there, quietly shaping who he was. As therapy continued, Terry began to confront an emotion he had tried to control for so many years: anger. He had once believed he had overcome his past, that he was different from his father. But as he dug deeper, Terry realized the anger still existed inside him. It didn't explode into violence the way his father's had, but it was still there, turning into distance, silence, and behaviors that destroyed his own life. The hardest part wasn't admitting the anger. It was admitting the shame. Terry Crews had built his entire life around the image of a strong man, but addiction had made him feel weak. He felt he had betrayed his family, betrayed the very values he had always tried to live by. In many therapy sessions, Terry had to voice things he had never told anyone before. The habits in the dark, the thoughts he was so ashamed of that he couldn't admit them, and each time he spoke them out, he felt like a layer of his protective shell was being peeled away. It was painful, but at the same time, it was the first step toward change. Terry began to understand that true strength isn't about hiding weaknesses. Strength is daring to face them. This wasn't a quick process. No miracle happened after just a few sessions. There were days Terry felt he was moving forward. There were days he felt he was back at square one. But for the first time in many years, he was no longer avoiding. He was facing himself. And that was the hardest battle of his life. Because this time, the enemy wasn't an opponent on the field. It wasn't a tough financial situation. It was the deepest parts of his mind, the fears, the memories, the mistakes. But in that process, Terry Crews also began to realize something important. The boy who once stood trembling in the corner of the room in Flint was still alive inside him. And instead of continuing to hide that boy's pain, Terry began to learn how to listen to it, how to heal it. It wasn't an easy path, but it was the only path that could save his family. And for the first time in many years, Terry Crews began to believe that his past didn't have to determine his future. But he still didn't know that this healing journey would lead him to an opportunity he had almost lost forever: the chance to rebuild his family. The months of therapy didn't bring instant change, but they began to do the most important thing. They made Terry Crews stop running from himself. For the first time in many years, he spoke out the things he had always kept hidden. He faced the wounds from his childhood, the simmering anger in his heart, and the shame he had carried for so long. But no matter how hard Terry tried to change, there was still one question he couldn't answer on his own. whether his marriage to Rebecca King Cruz still had a chance, because healing himself was one thing. Healing a deeply wounded relationship was something entirely different. In the days after that painful conversation, Rebecca kept her distance from Terry. She needed time, not to punish him, but to understand her own feelings. She had spent years trusting this man. She had stood by him when he had no money, no fame, no clear future. But now she had to ask herself whether that love was still strong enough to overcome the hurt she had just experienced. Terry understood that, for the first time in his life, he didn't try to justify himself. He didn't try to explain too much. He just did one thing he had never done properly before. He was honest. He told Rebecca everything. No hiding, no downplaying, no trying to make the story sound easier. He admitted his mistakes and acknowledged that he needed to change if he wanted to keep his family. That honesty didn't immediately fix everything, but it opened a door that had almost completely closed. Rebecca began to see something she hadn't seen in many years: humility. The man who once tried to appear strong in front of everything was now admitting he needed help. And sometimes that very admission was a sign of real strength. After many long and painful conversations, Rebecca made her decision. She chose to stay. But not because everything was fine, not because the wounds had disappeared, but because she believed Terry Crews could still become the man she had once loved. However, that decision came with a clear condition. Terry had to change. Not temporarily, not just to get through the crisis, but real change from the inside. For Terry, that wasn't an easy demand, but it was a second chance he knew he might never get again. So he started over from the beginning. Not as an athlete, not as an actor trying to build a career, but as a husband learning again how to love. He continued therapy. He read books about relationships and healing. He learned to express his emotions instead of keeping them in silence. These things sounded simple, but for a man who grew up in an environment where emotions were often turned into violence, it was a completely new journey. Terry also began spending more time with his family, not just being physically present, but truly listening and engaging in the lives of those around him. He learned to become the husband Rebecca deserved. A husband who didn't hide, who didn't live two lives. A husband who could be vulnerable when needed, because he no longer feared that vulnerability would make him like his father. Over time, Terry's change became clear, not because he said he had changed, but because his actions began to prove it every day. Rebecca saw that effort. She saw a man trying to break the old cycles of his past, and little by little, the trust between them began to rebuild. Not quickly, not perfectly, but step by step. Terry Crews later often said that the moment Rebecca decided to stay was one of the greatest gifts of his life, because it didn't just save their marriage, it saved him. It gave him the chance to become the man that trembling boy in the house in Flint had always hoped he would become. But just as family life began to stabilize again, another challenge was waiting for Terry Crews in a place he didn't expect: Hollywood. As his marriage to Rebecca King Cruz began to heal little by little, Terry Crews' life gradually moved into a new phase. After years of struggling to make ends meet, opportunities in the entertainment industry started to appear. Small roles in films and television, commercials, auditions, all of them slowly opened the door to Hollywood. To audiences, Terry Crews was a standout figure, nearly 6 feet tall, muscles like a professional athlete, a wide smile, and an energy that seemed never to run out. In comedies and action movies, he was often cast in strong, humorous, and confident roles. But behind the lights of Hollywood, Terry Crews was still a man trying to hold on to the life he had almost lost. He worked hard, trying not to repeat the mistakes of the past. He wanted to be a better husband, a better father, and a more honest man with himself. However, Hollywood wasn't always a fair or kind place, and one night, at an industry party, Terry Crews faced a moment he would never forget. That party was like many others in Hollywood. Bright lights, music, laughter, and conversations among producers, actors, and agents. Events like that were often where relationships were built and opportunities were created. For an actor trying to establish his place, showing up at those places was almost mandatory. Terry Crews walked into the room with the confidence many people were familiar with when they saw him on screen. But within minutes, an incident happened that left him completely stunned. A powerful agent in Hollywood approached him. At first, it was just a normal conversation, but then, in front of many people around them, the man suddenly reached out and grabbed Terry Crews' genitals. Hard. That moment happened very quickly, but for Terry, it felt like time suddenly slowed down. In the room full of lights and laughter, the nearly 6-foot-tall giant stood frozen. The man with muscles who had once played in the NFL, the man audiences thought no one could bully. But in that moment, Terry Crews was completely powerless. His first instinct was to fight back. Part of him wanted to push the man away, to hit back, to do something to protect himself. With his physical strength, he could easily have done it, but in a brief second, Terry Crews also realized a brutal truth. If he hit that man right there at the party, the story the next day wouldn't be about him being groped. The story would be about a large black actor attacking a powerful agent in Hollywood, and his career could end right then. That thought made Terry stand still. He could only look at the man, trying to stay calm while inside he was a storm of emotions. The agent eventually walked away, as if nothing had happened, and Terry Crews stood there, in the middle of the crowded room, with a humiliation he had never felt before. Later, Terry said that moment reminded him of the helplessness that little boy in Flint had felt. The feeling of standing in the corner of the room, watching something wrong happen, but being unable to do anything. Once again, he felt his power taken away. When Terry told Rebecca about the incident after the party, her first reaction was anger. She wanted him to go back and confront the man. But Terry knew it wasn't that simple. Hollywood was a world where power and fame could decide a person's fate, and he was still in a fragile position in this industry. So Terry Crews chose silence. But that silence didn't bring peace. The humiliation from that night haunted him for years. Every time he remembered it, he felt the anger and shame rise up inside. He wondered if he should have done something different, if he should have fought back harder. But what hurt Terry the most was realizing that experiences like that weren't rare in Hollywood. People just didn't dare speak out. And for many years, Terry Crews was one of those who stayed silent. Until a movement began to change the way the world viewed stories like that. And when that moment came, Terry Crews would have to make a different decision. A decision that required more courage than any game he had ever played on the field. For many years after that night, Terry Crews carried the memory of the incident like a silent wound. He continued working, continued building his career in Hollywood, continued appearing in public with his familiar smile. Audiences saw a strong, energetic man, but inside him was still the humiliation and powerlessness from that moment at the party. Many times Terry wondered if he should speak out, but every time he thought about the consequences, he stayed silent. Hollywood was a place where power could decide so many things, and the man who groped him wasn't a nobody. He was someone with position, connections, and influence in the entertainment industry. For Terry, who was still trying to establish his place, speaking out could mean closing the door on his career, so he chose silence. But that silence never made the memory disappear. Every time he recalled it, the same question came back to his mind. If I don't speak out, how many others will this continue to happen to? Then one day, the world began to change. Stories that people used to keep quiet started being told openly. The Me Too movement spread across Hollywood and many other areas of society. People who had been harassed or abused began sharing their stories, and for the first time, they were heard. When Terry Crews saw those stories appear in the news and on television, he felt something he had never felt before. He wasn't alone. The experiences he once thought were his own turned out to be things many others had gone through too. And it was in that context that Terry Crews made a decision he had always feared before. He decided to tell the truth. When Terry first publicly shared his story, many people were surprised, because the public image of him was a man who seemed almost untouchable, tall, muscular, once played in the NFL, but Terry himself explained that physical strength doesn't protect people from the abuse of power. He said that when it happened, he didn't fight back, not because he was weak, but because he understood the power system he was standing in. If he had hit the man, the story would have been flipped, and he himself could have been the one punished. Terry Crews speaking out quickly drew public attention, but he didn't stop at just telling his own story. He decided to take the issue to a place very few in the entertainment industry had ever gone, the United States Congress. When he stood before lawmakers in a hearing, Terry Crews didn't speak as a Hollywood star. He spoke as a human being who had once experienced having his power taken away. In his testimony, he said a sentence many people couldn't forget. "I know what it feels like to have your power taken away." It wasn't just a story about a party in Hollywood. For Terry, it brought back a long history of moments when he felt helpless. When he was a boy in Flint, Michigan, watching his mother suffer violence and being unable to do anything. When he was a backup player in the National Football League, always fearing he would be replaced tomorrow. And when he stood in a room full of power in Hollywood, realizing that his physical strength couldn't protect him from the abuse of power. Terry Crews' words touched so many people, not just victims of sexual harassment, but also those who had ever felt their voice taken away in life. His story showed that the abuse of power can happen to anyone, even a tall man who once played professional football. After that hearing, Terry Crews received thousands of messages from all over the world. People he had never met wrote to thank him for saying what they didn't have the courage to say. Many said his story made them feel seen and heard. For Terry Crews, that was the moment he realized speaking the truth didn't just help heal himself. It could also help heal others. And in the long journey from a trembling boy in the house in Flint to a man standing before the United States Congress, Terry Crews began to understand that his true strength didn't lie in his muscles. It lay in the courage to tell the truth. After his testimony before Congress and the months of standing up to speak the truth, Terry Crews' life moved into a different phase. He was no longer just a funny actor on television or a former player in the National Football League. In the eyes of many, he became a symbol of courage. But for Terry, titles or public attention were never the most important thing. The most important thing to him had always been in a very private place, his family. After all the upheavals he had gone through, a violent childhood, a sports career that ended quietly, years of poverty, a marriage that nearly fell apart, and the humiliation in Hollywood, Terry Crews understood one thing more clearly than ever. True success isn't the roles, the contracts, or the praise. True success is becoming the man his family can trust. Terry and Rebecca King Crews have a large family with 5 children. Each child grew up in a world completely different from Terry's childhood. No nights filled with screams, no fear. Every time the door opened, no father coming home drunk and making the whole family tremble. Terry often says that one of the biggest motivations in his life was breaking the cycle he witnessed as a child. When he was a boy in Flint, Michigan, Terry once thought every family was like his. He thought the beatings, the screams, and the fear were a normal part of life. But as he grew up, he realized violence isn't destiny. It's a choice. And he decided he would never repeat that choice. So in Terry Crews' home today, there is one principle he always tries to uphold: no violence, no fear, only respect and love. That doesn't mean he's always perfect. Terry has admitted that being a father is one of the greatest challenges of his life. Because every time he faces a difficult situation with his children, he has to ask himself a question many people never have to ask. What would my father have done in this situation? And then he has to do the opposite. Terry tries to be present in his children's lives in ways his own father never was with him. He talks to them. He listens to them. He hugs them. Those seemingly simple things carry enormous meaning for a man who grew up in an environment lacking gentleness. There are moments that touch Terry deeply, like when one of his children runs to hug him after a long day, or when they share their small worries of youth with him. In those moments, Terry often thinks about the boy from years ago. The boy standing trembling in the corner of the room, wishing he had a father who could protect him. He knows he can't change his own past, but he can change his children's future. And that's what drives him every day. Terry Crews once said that being a father is the most important role of his life. No script, no director, no stage lights, just small choices every day, choices that decide what kind of world his children will grow up in. For Terry, every time he chooses patience over anger, every time he chooses listening over imposing, he's doing what his father couldn't do. He's becoming the father he never had. And in the Crews family home today, there is something the young Terry never knew: peace. But Terry Crews' journey isn't over yet, because after all the battles he's overcome, he still has a greater legacy waiting to be written. A legacy not just for his family, but for the millions who have seen his story and found hope in it. As the years passed, Terry Crews' story gradually became more than a personal tale. It became a symbol, not a symbol of the muscular strength audiences usually see on screen, but a symbol of a different kind of strength, the strength of kindness, of honesty, and of the ability to change oneself. In Hollywood, where the image of the strong man is often tied to aggression and power, Terry Crews represents the opposite. A man nearly 6 feet tall, with a body that once played in the National Football League, yet he speaks about compassion, healing, and men's responsibility in society. Many began calling him by a very special name, the Gentle Giant. That title didn't come from a role. It came from the way Terry Crews has lived his life after everything he's been through. Terry understands very well that his past could have turned him into a completely different person. A boy raised in violence could easily carry that violence into adulthood. But instead of repeating that cycle, Terry Crews chose to break it. And that very decision shaped who he is today. In recent years, Terry has begun using his fame to speak about issues he understands better than anyone: domestic violence, the silence of victims, and the power of speaking out. Every time he shares his story, he mentions those childhood nights in Flint, Michigan, where he watched his mother endure violence for years. Terry often says that domestic violence doesn't just hurt the person being hit. It hurts the children who witness it too. It creates psychological wounds that can last a lifetime. And that's why he feels a responsibility to talk about it. Terry Crews has participated in many campaigns to raise awareness about domestic violence and protect victims. He speaks at schools, conferences, and community events. His message is very clear. A man's true strength doesn't lie in his ability to cause fear. It lies in his ability to protect others from that fear. For many people, seeing Terry Crews stand up to talk about vulnerability, shame, and healing is something rare in the world of action stars. But that's exactly what makes his story so powerful. He doesn't try to be a perfect role model. He speaks openly about his mistakes, about his marriage to Rebecca King Crews that nearly ended, about his years of addiction, and about the fears he once kept hidden. And that very honesty makes millions feel his story is relatable, because they see something important in it. If Terry Crews can change, then anyone can change. In his entertainment career, Terry continues to appear in roles audiences love. But for him, fame is now just a tool to spread the messages he believes society needs to hear. When Terry Crews steps onto a stage or appears on television, audiences still see his familiar smile and positive energy. But behind that smile now is a story many people know. The story of a boy who once lived in fear. The story of a man who had to confront the darkness in his own soul. And the story of a person who chose kindness over anger. That is the legacy Terry Crews is building. Not just through movies or TV shows, but through his very life. And when he looks back on the long journey from a trembling boy in the house in Flint to a man admired by millions, Terry Crews understands that humanity's greatest strength isn't defeating others, it's defeating oneself. But to fully understand Terry Crews' legacy, we must look back at his entire journey, from the pain, the collapse, to the strength that helped him rise again and again in life. Because sometimes a person's story isn't written by victories, but by the times they refuse to give up. At 57 years old, Terry Crews stands before the world not just as a famous actor or a familiar face on American television. Many know him through his humorous roles in Brooklyn Nine-Nine, through his energetic hosting on America's Got Talent, or through his strong performances in action movies. But if you look deeper into the journey of Terry Crews' life, you'll see that the title of actor is only a very small part of his story. Because before all of that, Terry Crews is a survivor. He survived a childhood full of violence. He survived the years of being forgotten after leaving the National Football League. He survived poverty, personal mistakes, a marriage that nearly fell apart, and moments of humiliation in the entertainment industry. And each time he got back up after those events, Terry Crews wrote another new chapter for his story. But if there is one thing that makes his story special, it is not the number of times he fell. It is his decision when he stood back up. Because Terry Crews was born into a cycle that many people before him could not escape, the cycle of violence. As a child in Flint, Michigan, Terry witnessed his father beating his mother many times. Those memories didn't just leave fear. They created a question he carried for many years. Would he one day become like his father? That was the greatest fear of his life. And in many difficult moments, Terry Crews felt that fear becoming more real than ever. When his marriage to Rebecca King Crews nearly ended because of secrets and addiction, when anger and shame threatened to destroy the family he had worked so hard to build, when memories of the past made him feel like he was repeating the very path he had once hated. But it was in those moments that Terry Crews made choices different from the man who raised him. Instead of violence, he chose healing. Instead of silence, he chose to speak the truth. Instead of avoidance, he chose to face himself. Those choices were not always easy. Sometimes they were even more painful than any game he ever played on the field. But step by step, Terry Crews broke the cycle that had existed in his family for generations. Today, when he looks at his family, he sees something the boy from years ago in Flint never had the chance to experience. A home without fear. A home where his children can grow up without worrying about sudden rages in the night. A home where strength is not defined by violence, but by love. And that is perhaps the greatest achievement in Terry Crews' life. Not the roles, not the fame, not the money, but the fact that he became the father he never had. Terry Crews often says that every person receives an inheritance from their past. Sometimes it is something good, but sometimes it is wounds. What matters is not what we receive. What matters is what we choose to do with it. Terry Crews received a painful inheritance, violence, fear, and silence. But he chose not to pass that inheritance on to the next generation. Instead, he turned it into the opposite: kindness, courage, and healing. And so Terry Crews' story is not just the story of a man who succeeded in Hollywood. It is the story of a person who refused to let the past decide his future. It is the story of someone who proved that even the deepest wounds can become a source of strength. And if we had to summarize Terry Crews's life in one single message, it would probably be this: some men inherit violence. Terry Crews chose to end it. The story of Terry Crews is both heartbreaking and inspiring because behind the powerful smile that American audiences are familiar with on television is an entire journey of survival full of scars. When looking back at his childhood in Flint, Michigan, where he had to stand in the corner of the room helplessly watching his father beat his mother, we understand that many children in America are also growing up in homes filled with fear just like that. The shame Terry carried throughout his life for not being able to protect his mother shows that domestic violence doesn't just destroy one woman, but also leaves psychological wounds for an entire generation of children. Then, as an adult, even though he once played in the National Football League, Terry still went through a period of poverty so severe that he had to draw courtroom illustrations and sell drawings to support his family. The tragedy continued when his pornography addiction nearly destroyed his marriage to Rebecca King Crews, and later came the humiliation of being groped at a Hollywood party where he couldn't fight back for fear of losing his career. But what makes Terry Crews's story worthy of admiration is not his successes on the screen or his roles in Brooklyn Nine-Nine, but the way he chose to confront his own darkness, going to therapy, speaking the truth before Congress during the Me Too movement, and committing to being a loving father to his 5 children, something he never received from his own father. For American society, the lesson from the story is very clear. A man's true strength does not lie in his muscles or power, but in his ability to break the cycle of violence, be honest about his mistakes, and build a safe family for the next generation. Terry Crews is not just a celebrity. He is proof that even the deepest wounds of America can be healed with courage and kindness. If the story of Terry Crews has touched your heart and reminded us that true courage is breaking the cycle of violence and pain, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you powerful and hopeful stories like this one. Thank you for listening to the journey of a man who chose kindness over violence, and see you in the next video.